In this demonstration, I will ensure that you understand how SAML resources work. Let's switch to Visual Studio. Here I've opened the Customers App project that you can download from the course homepage on pluralsight.com. Now let's expand here the controls folder and let's open here the header control SAML file. On the root grid in the SAML file, the background property is set here to this orange value. Now imagine you want to use that value also in other places in this SAML document or maybe at other places in your application. Instead of copying this value, you can also define it as a resource. To do this, you find on every element in WPF a resources property. So for example, you find one on the grid. As you can see, it has a resources property. You find also a resources property on the user control. But instead of setting this property with the attribute syntax, you normally use the property element syntax. So let's write here the property element userControl.resources to set this property. Now, this property is of type resource dictionary, which means you can add multiple elements to it. In this case, let's add a solid color brush and let's set the color property to that value that we have defined here for the background property of the grid. Let's assign this and now let's close this element. As you can see, the solid color brush is underlined and when you hover it, you can see here a message that all objects added to an iDictionary must have a key attribute or some other type of key associated with them. What does this actually mean? Let's go to the Solution Explorer and let's open the code behind file of the header control so that you can take a look at the resources property in C#. So here in the constructor, let's write this and let's write resources, and you can see this property is of type resource dictionary. This means on that property you can call the add method to add an object to the resources of this control. As you can see, the add method requires a key and under that key the object is stored. This means in SAML you also need to define the value for the key parameter of the add method. So let's remove this again and let's go back to the header control SAML file. To define the key for this solid color brush object, you use in SAML the xKey attribute. Let's give this brush the key header background brush. Now, instead of using here this hard-coded value, you can use now the static resource markup extension. When you press space, you can select here the header background brush, and now this brush is used for the background property of the grid. You could also define other brushes here. For example, here for the foreground property, let's define another brush. I just copy this one and I call it header foreground brush, and here I define the color white. Now let's go down here to the foreground property and here let's also use the static resource markup extension, and in this case let's select here the header foreground brush. Now important to understand is how this static resource markup extension actually works. Let's take this one here as an example. It looks first into the resources property of the grid and it does not find the key header background brush in that resources property. This means it goes one level up to the next parent, which is the user control, and here it finds the brush with the key header background brush. This means, in other words, that these two resources are available in this SAML document. But if you go, for example, to the Solution Explorer, and if you open up the main window SAML file, and now let's say you want to use that header background brush also for the background property of the status bar, when you write here static resource, you can see nothing pops up, because that resource is not visible in this SAML document. But instead of declaring resources in a local SAML document, like you did it here, you can also declare them application-wide. So let me cut here the two brushes from the user control's resources. and let's remove the property element. Now, the static resource markup extension here does not find this key in the grid resources and also not in the user control resources. The user control is the root element of this SAML document and it does not contain the resource. In a next step, the static resource markup extension looks into the app.saml file where you can define application-wide resources. So let's open the app.saml file, and here you see already the application resources property element. I paste the two brushes into these application resources, and now you can use them application-wide. Let's go again to the Solution Explorer, and let's open again the main window SAML file. Here in the main window SAML file, when you write static resource, you can see now also these two brushes. So let's use here the header background brush, and now let's run our application. As you can see now, the status bar has the same background as the header control. Now let me move the application to the left side of my screen and Visual Studio to the right side. In Visual Studio, I open the app.saml file, and now let's change in this app.saml file the header background brush to, for example, the value green. Now you can see here the header and also the status bar are using that new color. I press Ctrl Z to change it back to the orange value. Now let's maximize Visual Studio and let's stop debugging. I go again to the main window SAML file and I remove here the setting of the background property from the status bar as I want it to have the default color. Alright, now you learned that SAML resources are searched upwards in the element tree, and if the resource is not found in the SAML document, the static resource markup extension looks into the SAML resources in the app.saml file. The app.saml file is the place where you define application-wide resources. Brushes are typical objects that you want to define as a resource. Another typical object is a binding converter. You will learn more about this in the next clip.